So, of course, I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about tips and tricks for the Loft command. So, really going to focus on the Loft command in particular today and all the things that you can learn just regarding how it's used. Right? We're talking about guides, curves, all the various tips and tricks that we have for creating a loft. Now, before we get into it, a brief agenda about what we're talking about here today. I want to start off with a simple introduction. So we're going to start off really simple with just an introduction to the Loft command. So those new to the Loft command, we'll go through what a loft is and the different basics that you'll need to create a simple loft. Then we're going to get into different guides and end conditions. So when we talk about guides and end conditions, these are two options within the Loft command that allow you to really adjust the shape of your loft. And I want to get into the different ways we can create guides and determine end conditions. And of course, throughout this entire webinar, I'm going to do my best to discuss all the various tips and tricks that I have for the Loft command, even things to watch out for, easy mistakes to make, and so on. So let's dig into it. Now, before I get into the details of the Loft command, I want to start really simple. So for those that are new to the Loft command, I want to discuss what is a loft. What do I mean when I say loft and the tips and tricks for the Loft command? And in short, loft is a command in the toolbar that you'll find that is very useful when you want a smooth transition between different shapes. So for instance, if I wanted a circle to round transition and I want a smooth transition between those types of profiles, I would use a loft command. That would be something that would be very difficult to create using extrude, revolve, or sweep. Right? These are more organic shapes, shapes that like you can see in the screenshot there, that would be difficult using an extrude, using a revolve, using any of those techniques. Right? So again, a simple answer to the loft, what is a loft? It's simply a smooth transition between profiles. Now, there are some things that I would just want to point out. So some general rules to consider when you're first getting started with the loft command. The first thing I would consider is you can have as many profiles in your loft as you would like. So there's really no limit to the number of profiles that you can have. And of course, as the loft gets more complex, it will need more profiles. If you think of some of the more complex lofts that you can create, a boat hole is a good example, where you might have many loft profiles along a single loft feature. So again, you can have as many profiles in your loft as you would like. And if that confuses you, just bear with me. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. The next thing I would say is it's very important in the loft command to select the profiles in order, either from left to right or right to left, top to bottom. The big thing is, as if you have more than 2 loft profiles, if you have 3 and up, make sure to select them in a specific order. Right? Do not jump from the first to the fourth to the second to the sixth. You want to go from top to bottom, left to right, wherever the orientation, but make sure that it's in order. So that's my next big tip. If you get more than 2 profiles, make sure to select them in order in the loft command. The next tip that I have is make sure that your profiles for your loft do not have nested contours within them. Now, what is a nested contour? It's just any enclosed contour, any closed contour within your loft profile. And I'll go over this in greater detail in a second, but you do not want 2 nested circles, for instance, and try and loft between them. Now, you can create a loft of the outside contour, create a loft of the inside contour, and accomplish the same thing, but it will require 2 steps. Make sure that your loft profiles don't have any nested or closed contours within them. The next tip, this is just a useful one in general. You can loft between non-planar faces. So a lot of the examples I'm giving here today and a lot of the things I've seen our users create are just from sketch profiles, 2D sketch profiles. Keep in mind, you can loft between any faces, even non-planar faces. Non-planar just simply meaning not flat, right? So you can loft between non-planar faces and not have to create any kind of sketch entities, right? Or not spend any kind of time in that part of it if all you want to do is a simple loft between 2 faces. Now, there's some other tips when we start talking about lofting between faces, especially when we get into like splitting the faces. That's another common technique in the loft command, which I'll mention in just a bit. But just keep in mind, again, in general, in Onshape, you do not have to loft between non-planar You do not have to loft between planar faces. They can be non-planar. They can be, any kind of curvature. The next tip that I have is more of a warning. You do not need to have the same number of vertices on each profile of your loft, but it really helps. And I'll explain what that means in just a bit. But keep in mind, if I'm lofting from a square to a square has 4 points, a circle has none, right? So how to map, where that transition takes place can be a difficult thing. I'm going to go over what that entails in just a bit, but one of the easiest ways to solve twist problems in your loft is to ensure that you have the same number of vertices in each sketch profile. Not always possible, but it can really save you a lot of time having to control the loft twist. And I'll get into all of this in a greater detail in just a bit. But again, if I had to point out 5 general rules to know as you're getting started, just keep in mind you can have as many profiles as you like, but as you get more than 2, make sure you select them in order. Right? Make sure that your profiles do not have any nested contours within them. No enclosed contours within them. You can loft between non-planar faces, so it's not just sketch geometry, right? You can select even non-planar faces and loft between them. You do not need the same number of vertices, but it really helps. And I'll discuss this in a second. All right, so enough slides. Let's dig into Onshape. And I want to start really simple. I'm going to start with just the most basic example and literally start from scratch here, just to give you a feel for the loft command if you haven't seen it before. So as I mentioned before, think of it as a simple transition between 2 profiles, and in this example, 2 profiles. So let's say that I wanted a simple transition between 2 ellipses, right? I'll start a sketch. We'll start an ellipse, like so, right? Add some dimensions, because of course we need dimensions. And now I have my first ellipse, right? I'll hit OK, and now I've got the first profile that I want to use in my loft, but I need to create the second. Now, there's all kinds of techniques that we can discuss for copying and pasting sketches and inserting sketch planes, and there's a number of different related tips that we're going to get into in just a bit, but one of the first and most common tips is just inserting an offset plane. Very common scenario in creating lofts, and really what I want here is an offset of the front plane. Right, so I'll select the front plane and choose the plane command. We'll choose an offset of say 3 inches, green check, and now I have an offset plane from the front. Right, now I have the plane that I want to start for my second profile of my loft. So I'll start a new sketch, and essentially what I want is another ellipse. Again, we're going to start really simple, just lofting between 2 ellipses. Right. There we go. Say 2.5, and let's say 4.5. All right, so I've got my 2 ellipses. I'm going to accept that second sketch, and now I'm ready to loft between them. So I select the loft command from the toolbar, and then select my profile. Left click, and now I have a loft between those 2 ellipses. Again, starting very simple. The shape is very similar on both profiles, and that's many times the case. And that makes the loft very easy. Just selecting each profile. I'm not really concerned about the amount of twists. There really is none. It's very simple in this case. Now, I mentioned earlier, do not use loft profiles. I'll accept here and just give you a look at the finished loft. You do not want to use loft profiles with nested contours within them. Now, the question then is, well, what's a nested contour? A good example of this is if I were to edit my original sketch and decide, you know what, let's drop in a circle here, right? This circle is a nested contour within my loft profile. If I try and loft with this sketch, it will fail. Right? So an easy solution would be to convert this to construction, use it somewhere else. If you need to create, a cut within your loft, you can do it as a separate feature. But keep in mind, a sketch like this will not work in the loft command. You can convert it to construction or just delete it and do it later. But just keep in mind, no nested, no closed contours within your loft profile. Okay? So that's what I mean by nested contours. You want to avoid those situations. I often get asked the question, what if I wanted to do another cut that comes in later. Well, you can easily create a separate sketch and accomplish that. But one general tip that I have, no nested contours within your Loft profiles. Now, this is a simple example. Again, we'll go to Loft, select our two profiles, and we have our simple Loft. What if I wanted another profile? Well, let's delete our Loft, and let's insert another plane. Right? So again, I'm going to click on that past plane that we had. We'll insert another plane referencing that one, and let's say 3 inches away. Now on this plane, I don't want an ellipse. Let's say that I wanted a circle. So I'm going to start a circle right here on the origin. Okay, so now I'm transitioning from 2 ellipses of changing size to a circle. I'll accept this third sketch, and now I have 3 sketches solely for this single loft. Now, this is still a simple loft to many people out there. There are many lofts that, more complex shapes, they're going to have many profiles. But for the sake of simplicity, now we want a loft between them. I select Loft, and I select my profiles. Now, remember before, I mentioned you want to select your profiles in order. And what I meant by that is, when you have 3 profiles, like I do here, and I'm viewing them from the side, I have ellipse, ellipse, circle. I'm looking at them from the side. I wouldn't want to select this one, and then come back to the middle, right? I'd want to start from, left to right, right to left, whatever the order may be, but I want to make sure to select them in order. And that's what I mean by that. Your loft could have many different profiles. Make sure when you're in the Loft command, like I am now, to select them in the order that you want the loft to go. And that's a very important step when you have more than 2, right? So make sure, just a general rule of thumb, when you get into the more complex lofts, to select them in order. And to show you what I mean, if I do this out of order, it's just going to fail. Left click, left click, left click. It thinks you're trying to loop it around, and clearly not what I intended, right? So just make sure to select them in order. Now you'll see I have a loft between 3 different profiles. It starts as an ellipse, it ends as a circle on the end. Question, is it not okay to select the outer ellipse specifically for the loft, not selecting the inner circle? That's not. You cannot do that. No, it's just one of the ways that Onshape works. It grabs the face created by the sketch geometry. And in that case, the face includes the circle in the middle. So you're not going to be able to do that. Again, unless it's construction. All right, so that's a simple intro into the Loft command. Really, you're transitioning between different profiles and creating a smooth transition between shapes. But these are all simple examples where just simple ellipses and circles that I'm lofting between. Everything's perfectly centered. Many times that's not the case. So let's get into some of the things that can go wrong with a loft command. Let's get into a little bit more complicated loft. So let's start a new sketch. And what I want to do is just create a center point rectangle. Now I mentioned before that in general, it helps to have the same number of vertices on each loft profile. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, if you think of a square and a round, a circle, right? So here I have a square, and let's say that I want to create a loft between this square and a circle, some distance out. Let's do a plane, offset, maybe 4 inches. Okay. And let's sketch a circle on this plane. Now, these are 2 very different shapes, of course, right? I have a circle has no points on the outside, no vertices on the outside. And I have a square that has 4 sides, 4 vertices, 2 very different shapes. Now, what happens in some scenarios like this is Onshape has to guess how that transition, how the 2 shapes are going to line up as it transitions between them. So in this example, it's still relatively simple. I have a square and a circle, and they're both, again, centered. So if I select Loft and I select each profile, I have relatively good looking loft from the shapes, right? So you can see this is my gradual transition from the square to the circle. So again, very simple, and in many situations this would be just fine. It may not be perfect, but it's it's good enough that it's not going to be an issue. Where this becomes an issue is when you have not only different number of vertices, but also things that aren't perfectly centered. So let me give you another example of a squared around, but this time let's do this. Instead of being constrained on the origin, let's delete this, and let's make it tangent to the bottom, like left corner here. All right, so now we have a squared around transition, but the circle isn't centered in the square. Right, so this is where when we try and loft, it's not going to be immediately clear. At least it may not be exactly how I intended the transition to look, because Onshape is essentially guessing at that transition point. So I'll give you an example. Let's loft again. Circle, square, right? And now if we look at from the front, you can see how the loft transitions. Now, this may or may not be something that you're satisfied with. That's something that you'd have to look at. But let's say, for instance, I'm just not happy with the way this transition. That's too much twist, so to speak. And that's often what it's referred to in the loft command as twist. And I want to be able to control how that transition takes place. Well, right now, the loft command, the square has 4 vertices, the circle has none. It has to guess at that transition between shapes. But I can control this. And the way I can actually control it a few different ways. One of the simplest ways to control this is to split my sketch up so that I have the same number of vertices in each sketch. The square has, of course, 4 vertices, so we need to split the circle into 4 pieces, right? And that allows us to control how that transition takes place. Question: can that hard edge be filleted when lofting from a square to a circle? Well, of course, you could easily do a sketch fillet there, sure, and loft between that profile as opposed to having square corners. So let's talk about how to control this twist. Let's say that I've done this loft, and this is often the case where I don't care for the way that it transitions. It transitions the way that I don't care for. It twists or whatever it may be. How would I control this? And again, as I mentioned, there's a number of different ways, but one simple way is to split each of your profiles up so that they have the same number of vertices. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to do this real quickly. What I like to do is just have construction lines that join my profiles together, right? All I'm doing here is giving myself points to split my sketch up. My circle sketch. And remember, the goal here is to split our circle into essentially 4 arcs and then allow Onshape to find those points and then loft between them. Now, it is a bit more work, of course, but this allows you to control that shape, right? So I'm just going to constrain the ends of my sketches here to the points behind them, all right? And again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip by dimensioning them. You would, of course, come in and properly dimension the construction lines. But let's split them. So let's say these are defined. This is exactly how I want my transition to look. What I'm going to do is use the split command in the sketch toolbar and just left-click that point where your construction line lines up with the circle. And then left-click another point, and now that's split. That's now one arc. Right, do the same thing again, point, and now we have 4 arcs instead of 1 circle. Now, of course, it's still a circle, it's just split into 4 pieces. The main thing that we've accomplished with this is we are now controlling exactly what that shape is going to look like when we go to do the loft, right? So when we choose our loft, we're saying this is where I want those points to line up. Right. So if I want to control the loft profile, one of the easiest ways is to make sure that each profile has the same number of vertices. If that happens, then it's easy for Onshape to line up the nearest one and give you the shape that you're looking for. It is a little bit more work, but what you'll find is in scenarios like this, the amount of twist in your loft may not be acceptable. It may not be something that you're comfortable with. So just keep in mind, splitting each profile up into the same number of vertices is probably one of the simplest ways to control that transition. All right, so now that we've covered the basics, what I want to get into now is a little bit more complex examples, a little bit more real-life examples where you might use the Loft command. And this is an example I like to show for the Loft command. It's a squeegee, and it uses Loft in a few really cool places. It's one of those parts that would be relatively difficult to create without the Loft command. Pretty difficult, in fact, to create without the Loft command. So if you think about this squeegee, this handle is a good example. I can't use a revolve feature here because it's not really symmetric, right? I can't use extrude or revolve, sweep even to accomplish this shape, at least not easily, right? And in the case of a loft, it's an ideal tool for that kind of an example. Now, the handle of the squeegee is really just constructed of a loft between two circles. So if we edit this loft feature, you'll see a circle on the right and a circle on the left. Two profiles in my loft. What's really unique about this and what gives it that kind of grip shape that you see are the guides. Now, we've discussed how to split loft profiles up and control that twist, but guides are taking that to the next level, right? They really allow you to manipulate the shape as it transitions between your profiles. So in this case, you can see that I have two guides. Edge of sketch 14, which is just a simple straightforward line, but then I have edge of sketch 13, which is this spline grip shape that's giving it that contour, right? So a relatively simple loft between two circles can be made really detailed with something like a guide. Now, guides allow you to control the transition between loft profiles. So another example of this, let's roll down to the transition here. Another example of this is that transition between shapes, right? When the squeegee to the actual squeegee head, right? So here I want to transition from what is the handle to the head of the squeegee. And if we look closely at this, there are actually different, forgive me, wrong loft, jump forward here. There are actually different guides involved in the creation of this loft, right? So you can see edge of sketch 6, edge of sketch 10, edge of sketch 7. These are just simple sketches created to control the transition from the handle to the head of the squeegee, right? This is another example, by the way, of a square to round transition, right? So I have these guides that have been constructed really of just simple sketches. So let's take a look at them, right? So let's roll up here above loft 1. And you can see each of the guides that were created. And if we take a look at one of them, it's essentially just a spline between each profile on a plane created by the 3 points in my circle and 2 points on my rectangle. So a 3-point plane. So very simple example, very basic example of a guide where it's just essentially a spline between each profile. Now, some tips when we talk about creating guides. One of the first and most important tips that I can give you is make sure that in some way your guide is attached to each profile. And what I mean by that is you can see in this example I have a pierce constraint and a coincident constraint that are attached to other pieces of geometry. That's very important. They're attached to the profiles that were used to create the loft. And the reason that's important is that's how it's able to determine that it's attached to the loft itself. So again, very important, make sure to attach your guide to each profile in your loft. You can use pierce or coincident, but it must be attached in some way, using either one of those. Right? So you wouldn't want to just sketch a guide out in space that's not constrained in any way to your profile. It won't work. Make sure that it's attached using either coincident or pierce, like you can see in these examples. Now, this is a very simple example of a guide using just a spline. But you can take this to the nth degree, and we can even get into curves, and we will in just a moment, that make this even easier. Right? But just keep in mind, when you're creating guides, make sure to attach the geometry to your profile. Right? Now, the key to this, and the key when creating these lofts, is to make sure that you've defined them in the guides. So in the loft command, there's a drop down here. You'll see two options, guides and in conditions. Now, in conditions allow you to match the surrounding geometry, right? So I can say, let's match this loft, maybe start condition tangent to profile or normal to profile. Maybe I want to extend that loft and match the surrounding faces, right? So really useful when you're referencing faces for your loft and you want a smooth transition from the outer edges of that face. I could do something like a normal to profile or tangent to profile if the scenario applies. You can also control the magnitude. How long is it normal to profile before it transitions to the other shape in your profile or in your loft. But that's really it. You can define guides or in conditions. Now, in conditions don't require any sketching. They're just referencing the faces that you've selected for your loft. The big thing there is they're very simple to use, and they tend to give very smooth contours if that's your goal, especially smooth with reference to things that you're referencing, other faces, in this case, like the handle. I really want a smooth transition from my handle out to this shape, and that's really critical for me. I don't want this to be a noticeable thing. So that's an example where in condition normal to profile is very easy, and it creates a very smooth looking loft. Now, again, guides kind of take that to the nth degree. They're definitely what many would consider a last resort, but they really give you the utmost control as well. I'm literally controlling that shape with a spline in a sketch. Now, one big tip that I have is, when you're constructing those guides, it's not in just the context of sketching a spline, it's not obvious what you're doing or what its immediate impact on the loft will be. So one big tip that I have is you can manipulate these splines later. So if I edit a sketch here, and you can click Final in the sketch dialog. In the bottom left corner of the sketch dialog, if you click Final, that will give you the final rebuilt model. And this is useful because now I can change this guide dynamically, and it will update the loft live. Right? Because a lot of times guides are kind of a trial and error, hit or miss. I'm just playing with it to see, what it's going to look like. And you don't want to go back and forth between editing the sketch, hitting OK, rebuilding, looking at the end result, going back to your sketch. You don't want to spend a lot of time going through that loop. Click Final in the sketch dialog, and then you can change the guide as you want, and the loft will live update. Right? The entire part will rebuild on the fly. So that's just a general tip. It really is useful in the Loft command, but it's useful really anywhere in the Onshape Art Studio. You'll see this button for Final, not just in sketches, but also features and anything that you want to see rebuild live, so you can kind of play with the different factors and see what their impact is on the finished result. So that's a tip on the Final button in the sketch dialog. Really useful, especially in the scenario where you're manipulating guides in your loft. So again, guides and in conditions are really the two ways that we have for controlling, in a very simple way, the loft transition, right? Either based on the surrounding faces in the case of in conditions, or geometry, or in the case of guides, actually sketch geometry. There is one more new option that I wanted to mention, and that is the loft with path option. And I think, especially in symmetric lofts where the transition's relatively straightforward, this can be a very simple way of controlling the loft's shape without constructing 4 independent guides. I can really control the loft contour that I want. Now, this is a relatively new option, so if you haven't used the loft command in a while, you may not be familiar with it. In the loft command, you'll see this checkbox for path, and it's a relatively simple thing to do. Again, very similar to a guide. Make sure that your path is attached to your profiles in some way. But it's really just a matter of choosing your path and then clicking on edges, curves, sketches, anything that you want. The really neat thing about this is it will automatically create those sections, those cross sections that you may need in the loft command. And this is something that users will spend a lot of time creating these. The most detailed lofts that you'll see will have many of these planes and cross sections, essentially, of the loft transition. And this is doing that automatically. And you can just set the section count, and it just goes up from there. So it's a very intelligent command in terms of these kinds of lofts, where you really just want kind of a symmetric transition, a center line path, so to speak, for your loft. Right? So this is a relatively new option, and it's very simple. You check the box and you click on your path. The path can be edges, curves, or in my case, you can see here a simple sketch entity. But that's a new option that allows you to control the shape. It's very fast with when you're comparing it to a whole bunch of independent guides, and even worse, sketching all of these individual sections. So very powerful new option in the Loft command. All right, so that's the Loft with path option, relatively new in the Loft command. What I'd like to do next is get into just some general commands that can really help you when we talk about lofts. And they're not necessarily specific to lofts, but they're just really helpful commands that can help you create really clean looking lofts. And the first and probably most important tool that I would recommend looking into if you're trying to create very smooth transitions, very clean lofts, are different curve commands. And these are, again, really new. In the last few months, we've added, basically all of these curve commands, and they really make a big impact in the Loft command. Now, these commands can be used elsewhere. Projected curve is useful in a lot of different situations, but it's particularly useful in Loft. And that goes for composite curve, bridging curves. They all have other uses, but very, very useful in the Loft command. I'll give you an example of some of these in a bit, but all of these are new curves added to your toolbar in the last few months, and they make creating, more specifically, 3D curve geometry very easy. And these can be really, really useful either as guides or as actual loft profiles, profiles that you're lofting to. So projected curve, composite curve, bridging curve, even 3D fit spline all have applications in the Loft command. It can be really useful. So the first thing I would stress is check out the curves if you're really looking for smooth transition between shapes and matching contours and things like that are very important. Chances are you'll be using one of these commands that you're seeing here. Now, the next thing, and these are just kind of random useful tips that I have for you. I've already mentioned sketch split. The sketch split is useful just for getting the same number of vertices on each loft profile. So the square and the circle that I gave you the example earlier, it helped for me to split the circle into pieces using sketch split. So that just allows me the same number of vertices. But there are other commands that can really be helpful. I didn't mention this, but it's one that's really big if you're lofting between non-planar faces, and that is the feature split. You can split a face up and then loft between the split faces, and that's really common when you don't want to, or you want really smooth curvature around non-planar geometry. You can define what I want to loft between these specific contours by first splitting the face and then lofting between the split faces. So the feature split is also a very useful command to split faces and loft between them. Right, so another very useful tip, again, not specific to Loft, just very useful in the Loft command. Now, you've already seen me create quite a few construction planes, and many of them are just simple offsets, but there's a lot of applications, as you can see, for custom planes creation in a Loft, right? So it's a very useful command. If you're not familiar with construction planes and inserting construction planes, definitely get familiar with it. Not just the simple offsets, but also curve point planes and things like that that can be helpful in defining your geometry for a loft. The last thing I'd mention, and this is something that a lot of users have asked, if you do a lot of the Loft command and you do a lot of the example I was giving you earlier where I insert a lot of planes, inserting them one at a time isn't really a practical thing, especially when you start getting into 15 and 20 and 30 planes. You really don't want to insert them one at a time. There's a custom feature called multi-plane custom feature that will insert 20 planes at once at a fixed distance for you. So it just makes that whole process of setting all your planes up for the Loft command really simple when they're evenly spaced like that. It will also do evenly spaced planes along a curve and all kinds of neat stuff. So in general, if you're looking for a tool that allows you to create a lot of planes really quickly using just about anything as for geometry as a reference, definitely check out the multi-plane custom feature. All right, so these are just some general tips that I have to make a big difference when we get into the loft command, and I wanted to take some time to discuss, in particular, the various curves. And I think those are the new thing that I wanted to discuss because I think they apply in a number of different situations. So I want to give you a few different examples of this. So just bear with me here. I want to start with the projected curve. And the reason I think this is important is there are many situations where, I want to define a 3D curve that's really just the intersection of two, sketch entities. And I want to define that as the geometry for a loft, for instance, the edge for a loft. And so let me give you an example. This is a, kind of a mouse shape modeled in Onshape, and it's modeled in Onshape using surfacing, right? So you'll see a number of different surfacing tools here. But the thing that I want to show is a technique that was often adopted very early on. And that is, I want a loft, but I need that 3D curve that's kind of the loft, the mouse's outside shape. And that shape's not 2D, it's not planar, right? It's a 3D curve, and it's essentially the intersection of this profile and this profile. And so what I saw a lot of is literally two extrudes like you're seeing here. This is just one surface and a second surface. The reason this is valuable is because that gives me this edge, right? That edge I can then loft between. So it's essentially this workaround to the inability to get the intersection of two sketch entities. And that's really where projected curve applies, right? So instead of, extruding a surface, figuring out where the intersection is and using that, I can just create a single projected curve, right? And literally all you do is select, your sketch entity, one piece, second sketch entity here, and you get that projected curve where the two intersect, right? So just saves you the steps. I don't have to go through as much effort creating that construction surface just for the purpose of getting the edge. Now I have my nice 3D edge that I can loft to create my mouse, right? So a simple example, but I think for a lot of users, projected curve is a valuable tool in creating that 3D curve that's really just the intersection of two, otherwise two surfaces. Very common operation that we see. So that's the projected curve command. Again, not specific to Loft, but very useful in creating both profiles and, of course, guides. All right, so that is the projected curve command. Now, the next one that I wanted to get into, let me jump back to my curve slide here, is the composite curve. Now, composite curve is useful in a lot of different scenarios. Think of any scenario where I want one guide that's a composition of maybe sketch entities or curves or a number of different multiple things. Like give you an example here. Let's say that I'm modeling a funnel, a simple funnel, which is just a squared around transition. And the squared around transition, I want to follow a very specific series of lines and arcs, right? So if we look at this, it's just a simple square in this case, lofting to a circle, lofting to a final circle on the bottom here. But I want the loft to follow this shape that I've sketched. But it's not a spline. This is a line, this is an arc, this is a line, right? So it's not one entity, it's three. And what you'll find if you're in this kind of scenario and you've sketched lofts using a combination of entities like I have here, is they won't work, right? So if I do a loft, I loft between these profiles, what will happen is you will choose your guide, you will choose one piece of what is essentially your guide. Your guide is really all three of these, and we'll assume that's the entirety of your guide, right? So it's just not the way the guide command works. Your guide must be one piece selectable for the entire loft. So how do you get around that? Well, you can use a composite curve and take this line, arc, line, and convert it to one selectable entity, right? It's a curve. So in this case, we can go to the composite curve in the toolbar, select line, arc, line, and now I have one selectable thing that is my guide, right? It's just one curve. You can see it here for that loft, right? Now when I go to do my loft, when I select my profiles, it will allow me to reference that curve, right? Right, so now I'm manipulating that shape based on what is essentially a combination of lines and arcs. Now, another big tip that I have for guide creation in general is make sure that you have a smooth transition in your guide. And what I mean by that is you'll notice there are no sharp corners anywhere in this transition, right? It's a line, arc line, all with tangent transition, so it's very smooth transition. You do not want a line with a sharp corner between them. Even if that's created into a composite curve, it will not work for the loft. So another big tip is make sure that you have smooth transitions for your guides. In this case, line, arc, line, but with tangent transitions. A spline is very useful in that case because you never have to worry about that. But just keep in mind, you want smooth transitions for your guides. You do not want sharp corners. So another example would be even just two, straight lines. In this case, if I had two different disjoint pieces that I want to make up one entity, I can use a composite. Now, I'm using sketch geometry for this, but it could be edges of the model. It could be other curves. So you could take, a combination of curves and an edge and some sketch geometry and turn it into one thing, one composite curve. And it makes it useful not just in the loft command, also very useful in the sweep command, right? Where maybe it's a combination of edges and a piece of sketch geometry that represents my sweep path. I can easily make it into one thing, and select it very simply. So again, composite curve, very useful when you want to take what is a bunch of different things and make them into one composite, right? One composite, hence the name. So, and it just makes it into one piece you can select, right? Very useful in the loft in the case of constructing guides. So that's the composite curve. Again, it's, I use sketch entities, but it could be using edges, sketch entities, other curves, if you want to, and they could be any combination of any of those things. All right, so the next example I have is the bridging curve. Now, bridging curve is really the command if you want the smoothest transition possible between contours. And the reason I say that is it gives you a curve, a 3D curve, that is matching tangency with an edge, which can be very useful in more dramatic changes of geometry. So the example, this is the same example I was showing you earlier. This is the same squeegee that I was showing you earlier. But one of the limitations of the example that I showed you earlier is, I created all those guides they were just splines on a 2D plane. They were 2D, right? They were flat splines, so to speak. They weren't 3D curves. And of course, 3D curves give me, open up a whole bunch of possibilities when we start talking about the transition between shapes. So in the examples I gave you earlier, it was still a very smooth transition between profiles, but they were guided by, splines on a 2D plane. If you want to take that really to the next level and you really want a smooth 3D curve that drives your loft, then really a bridging curve is something you should be looking at. And an example I give is that same squeegee, and you can see the only real difference here is I've split the handle into pieces where I want those curves to line up. Now, we'll start really simple. I choose the bridging command from the toolbar, and then I left click a point on each side. So the most basic bridging curve, by default, you'll see match position, and I can just click point, and I'm going to get, made the mistake there, make sure to click second side, then click point. And then I get a bridging curve between them. Of course, I get a sharp transition just between 2 points. So it's a simple curve between 2 points. Now, that's a very simple example of a bridging curve, and if that's all you want, great. But the power of this command, at least in my opinion, is the ability to match tangent. And this is really when you get into the ability to match surrounding edges. And really, if you think about what I want, is I want a transition curve that is tangent with this edge, and tangent with this edge, right? So that it's a smooth transition between the two. So in this case, we can choose match tangent, and I can just click those edges, right? So instead of defining points, I'm now defining edges and saying match these edges. Make sure that you're tangent with these edges, right? So real simple. Now, there are controls for this. So you can grab the manipulator and change the magnitude and the bias. Very neat way to really, specifically control the transition between shapes. If you want to weight it, so to speak, on one end or the other, you could do that by grabbing and dragging. I can also change the magnitude by grabbing the arrow and dragging. But again, essentially you're getting a smooth transition between edges that you've defined. Very useful in an example like this where I want to create my loft contours, and I don't want to be limited by sketching on a plane. And I think that's the big reason you would use a bridging curve. I want a 3D curve, not a 2D curve, to put it simply. So now if we want to create a loft, we could do that pretty quickly, just by lofting between the two faces and then defining each of those edges, as my guides. A good example here of the twists that you may not want, right? So just keep in mind when you're doing this is a good example of what you might get by default, and then you may have to come in and use your guides, in this case, just bridging curves, to control that shape, right? So notice as I click on each of these bridging curves as my guides, I'm really, manipulating the shape based on those 3D curves that I've created. So that's a simple example of a bridging curve. I think very useful in an example like this where I want to align my loft with edges of the model, and I want to ensure it's a smooth transition from those edges. Right. Questions: can a composite curve be made from connected sketches on multiple planes? I don't see why not. Yeah. In the example I'm picturing in my mind, I don't see why it would be an issue. I don't think so. I don't think it would be a problem. Again, assuming they're connected. Will the feature fail if a guide fails? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If your guide is failing in a way that causes the feature to fail, if it's dependent on it and, all of a sudden it's not attached to the geometry, then yes, it will cause the loft itself to fail. All right, so yeah, I'm fairly certain of that. It doesn't, fairly certain. Forgive me, I'm about 90% certain that it will cause the loft to fail. All right, so those are the things I wanted to mention. Now, I don't have an example specifically of 3D fit spline, but I think it's useful in a number of different scenarios. It's also a very useful command in the sweep command for creating a sweep path. But it really, 3D fit spline just allows you to select points, and it creates a spline between those points. Very useful in just creating a smooth guide very quickly, right? Each of the points would be a point on your profiles of your loft. So just to recap real quickly, some tips for guides. Make sure that your guides are attached to your profiles. Even in the case of the bridging curve and those are actually attached to each profile, right? Because of the way they're constrained by the edges. So again, in general, whether it's sketch geometry or not, make sure that your guides are attached to your profiles. Coincident or pierce, depending on the scenario, you're probably going to use a combination of both. Pierce maybe in the more complex examples, but coincident and pierce, make sure that it's attached to each profile. And that's another thing too, is if you have a guide, you have several profiles in your loft, and you have a guide that connects all of them, make sure that the guide is attached at each profile using either coincident or pierce. So that's a very important thing. The next thing is they must be smooth. As I mentioned before, make sure that you have a smooth transition. Don't have sharp transitions in your guides. Add a sketch fillet, some kind of smooth transition so that you do not have that sharp corner. So that's another big tip. And I already mentioned this one, but the final button can be really useful when you're manipulating all of these things. And it's not just, the example I gave you earlier, I was manipulating a spline and the loft live updated. That's one very useful example. You could just as easily use that, edit a sketch after you've created a projected curve and manipulate it manually and watch the projected curve update. So lots of examples where final button is a really key thing, especially in any kind of scenario where you're kind of playing with the shape and you just want to see what's going to happen without a lot of back and forth. So the final button, useful in editing guides, useful in editing curves, when you have any of those kinds of scenarios where you just want to play with the shape. So those are just some general tips for the loft command that I have for you. Really just kind of the starting point to help you get the more complex lofts going, and some general rules of thumb, some things to follow when we talk about creating lofts. Now, I am going to stick around and answer any questions that you have. So feel free to ask any questions in the questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll stick around and make sure to answer all of them. But that's what I had planned. I want to say thank you, everyone, and have a good day.